Greetings, everybody. I'm Jeremiah.
That's him.
She's Vania.
That's me. Welcome to another episode of the Beard and Curls podcast, where we talk about dating, relationships, marriage, mental health, and so much more.
So what are we talking about today, love?
Today, we're going to be talking about radical love.
So what exactly is radical love? Well, we're going to get into that right now. Cue that intro.
What's up, guys? It's your girl, Margot Bingham.
Karen Parsons.
You're now tuned in.
You're now tuned in.
You are now tuned in.
You are now tuned in
to Beard and Curls.
Beard and Curls.
Beard and Curls.
Beard and Curls.
Beard and Curls. Keep it locked.
Our guest today is a TEDx presenter, published author, and a business owner. More importantly, she is committed to pursuing justice and equity through love.
You know her, you love her.
Olivia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Glad to have you. Now, you have a popular YouTube TED Talk on radical love. Now, for people who are not familiar with this concept, can you explain to us what that is?
Absolutely. So radical love is basically a strategy for confrontation. I pose love as an action and as a behavior, not just a feeling. And it's something that can be applied to oppressive systems as a defensive and offensive and a resolution strategy.
Awesome.
Okay. And how can radical love basically help with oppression?
I would say first and foremost, focus the love on yourself and the people you're helping, the people you're fighting for. Just because oftentimes we pose, love in conflicting situations as starting with loving your enemy. And that's a really tough point to start with. So by loving the people who you're fighting for, you're realizing, how many people there are to break free with you, not necessarily having a focus on who is, feeling this burden of oppression, but who is with you to push back. And then also focusing on what you have to gain and loving the idea of liberation and freedom so much to where you are focused on more so on that rather than hatred for who is your opposing force and who is the person placing the burdens upon you. And so with those two things, with strategizing and with pushing forward by how much love you have for the people that you're fighting for, eventually when you win, you can get to that point of loving your enemy. And for some people, they're blessed to be able to do that along the way. I think for a lot of us, that's a journey to get to that spot. But if we can start with, loving ourselves, loving the people we're fighting for, and loving the cause we're fighting for, we can get there.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you tell a group of people who've been oppressed for as long as, African Americans have been oppressed in this country to say, love the people that, you're fighting for? You know what I mean? Love your enemies and love the people that you're fighting for. How can you break down that part of it for this particular group?
Well, I think, the tough situation is breaking our picture of what we think of love as. A lot of people view love as solely submission or as passivity or as nonviolence. And I think love can still exist when those things are not present, because you aren't necessarily focused on punishing a person, or you're not focused on retribution. You're more focused on resolving the situation. So to not love a person, to not love the opposing force would mean to change your focus to, causing them to fall into harm's way and causing them to have to pay you back. And I think there is a very appropriate place for reparations, but I think there's a difference between wanting people to be held accountable and seeking vengeance. And so being able to place love in a place to where you can say, okay, these are the boundaries that this group has violated and they should be held accountable, but I'm going to stay in a mental and emotional space to not place hatred into the situation.
How easy is it to do that, actually? Because that's a very cool concept. I love it.
Thank you. It's a challenge. I will give you that. It's not natural, I would say. I don't think it's the natural thing to want the best for someone who is hurting you or has harmed you historically. And even as you look at people who have studied this and people who have spoken on this, such as Dr. Martin Luther King, it's not this, easy way out. I think it's the much tougher way. because I think our nature is bent towards, wanting to fight fire with fire, or also wanting to rise to the energy that is coming at you. And so I think it's very difficult, but it's also very possible. And I think it can still exist within the framework of pushing back. I think to reiterate, loving your enemy is not the same as, just sitting here and watching everything happen and hoping, people are never put into the place where they have to actually pay for what they've done. And so I think it's a mental space more so than an attitude, if that makes sense. And so it's very difficult, but also very possible. And I think that's what will keep people fueled to keep fighting, because eventually, if it were hatred, it would wear you out, it would weigh on you. Whereas love is a motivator, it's an energy that pushes you. And so I think for, the fighter's sake, it's essential to keep love as the focus, because then your focus is more on solving the problem.
Definitely.
So you talk about love as a foundation and love as a goal. Can you describe the difference?
Okay. I think this is an interesting concept, just because I think, naturally, but also especially within this generation, we look at falling in love as a goal of a relationship. Personally, I don't believe in falling in love, which sounds a little strange because, love is the platform that, I'm building, my network on. But I say that because if love starts as the foundation, it's not necessarily something you work towards, but some place you work from. So as I said earlier, how love is an action and a behavior and not necessarily a feeling. If those actions look like transparency and prioritization and sacrifice and compromise, those actions as a foundation will help you reach a different goal, whether that is marriage, whether that is continuing, to grow with a person who is constantly changing, as we all are. I think having that as the foundation will propel you for longevity and will propel you to stay solid with a person rather than working towards that being the end goal. Because if that's the end goal, then where do you go once you do reach that? I also say that as an outsider from a relationship, though. But I think that's my mindset going into, how I see other people as they've modeled successful relationships and, what they have created and what they wish they would have done is act out love sooner.
So then you kind of just hinted on that, because we've been talking about it now. You talked about love as a choice and love as a feeling. So when you hear somebody says love is a feeling, what do you say to that?
I guess it kind of goes with, the behavior or with the action. I think also the feeling of love is something we attach a label to that has a lot of other feelings underneath, such as infatuation, attraction, all these other things. And I think we're limited in the rhetoric of it, just because there are things that we often see as love because it's something that makes us feel good. But remembering that, with the actions that are carried out, it may not always make us feel good. It may not always be something that, we look forward to prioritizing a person. We're not always going to look forward to the sacrifices. And so realizing that a feeling can be there, and hopefully it is. Hopefully, people who are in love are also happy and are also, fully invested in one another. But I think also realizing that feelings are very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very fickle. It can change, it can grow, it can decrease. And so I think realizing that, yes, that feeling can be there, that feeling of love, but realizing that there's some other things going on, and that's not necessarily the sole way to describe someone's feelings, just because there's so much to unpack on what that could describe. If you look at, different terms around the world and in different languages, there's a lot more ways to describe, certain feelings or certain states of a relationship that aren't necessarily, revolved around the word love, or revolved around that sole idea that comes to mind when we think of loving a person. And so I think that kind of calls us to explain ourselves a little bit better when we speak on the feeling of love and really unpack what that means. Because that could also mean a lot of different things for different people.
Right. No, that's true.
Yeah, definitely.
I appreciate that. So another thought too is you mentioned like at times we subconsciously associate love with danger. Can you kind of break that part down for us a little bit as well?
Right. So I think, when you see on television and when you see in movies, when someone says love, oftentimes they'll say the L word. Um, it's kind of this fearful thing, just because it seems like an area that not a lot of people, it's not that many people experience. It's that there's a level of exclusivity to it, and uncertainty. And so I think we also very much associate, crossing that line of being in love with a level of vulnerability. And so there's a very important line of finding a space to be in love where you're safe enough to be vulnerable, because that will eliminate the fear of danger and uncertainty and risk. And I think with that in mind, with the level of danger in mind, it kind of encapsulates us to fitting into this one space of not being able to explore the ideas and conversation that is necessary to actually build that foundation and develop into a space where you can grow with a person. So having a space where you can seek to grow in love, where you can seek to develop these habits and actions that display your love for a person, and allow you to be vulnerable enough and not allow another person to be vulnerable in return, you're eliminating that danger, whereby allowing a free space for that healthy development of a good relationship, but also a good understanding of what you might actually feel or what you might actually choose to do with a person, whether that is deciding that a person is the right one for you, whether that is deciding that you want to grow with a person mentally, business-wise. And I think it goes beyond just relational love. In loving your family members and loving your friends, I think there's a space where you really want to enjoy people on a deeper level, but oftentimes certain things that might be disclosed call for a level of vulnerability that feels very dangerous. And love can eliminate that danger, but also it can protect you from where that danger is valid, and you should not grow, you should not expand.
Right. No, definitely. And I really like that you talked about how it's not just a relational love. Like it's not just, just subject to just romantic love. It's between friends, business partners, family members, and things like that. So it's really just meant to kind of help you go deeper with the love that you may have for somebody. So, all right. Awesome.
What is the correlation between radical love and boundaries?
That's a very good question. So I think when you think of something radical, it's definitely something that's pushing boundaries, pushing norms. And I'm a very big person on boundaries, and knowing, when they should be placed and when they should be dismantled. But I think in, unpacking radical love in terms of boundaries, realizing, if this is the line that has never been crossed in regards to, pushing back, in regards to, conceptualizing someone who has been an enemy as someone who you can potentially love as, someone who's not your enemy. You have to decide what boundary will and will not be crossed. I think in, my TED Talk, I give an example about, the Canadian politician who was being heckled and showed love to the person who was heckling him. At that point, I believe he crossed the boundary of, not saying, okay, security, please escort her. He pushed back. And I think, the boundary, is discovered when there's a point to push back on. And so when he pushed back, you see that there is this display of being able to implement these actions of love. And so I think oftentimes the boundary is the place of implementation, the place where you can actually decide to make the choices of, putting a person on a pedestal they do not necessarily deserve. Or maybe it's not a pedestal, maybe it's a treatment you give them that they do not deserve, a grace, a mercy that you allow them to experience even when they are not deserving of that. And so when someone crosses that line and you are given the opportunity to choose whether or not to display an act of love, I feel as though that's the boundary that exists. At the same time, I will say, there should be some non-negotiables. If someone is harming your family, if someone is harming you, that is a very difficult space to say, I'm going to love this person and allow, them to, harm or do whatever. And I think that's oftentimes where people have a misunderstanding of what it means to love radically. Because unfortunately, I think when we conceptualize love, I think oftentimes we've been put into a space, whether it's through what we read or the relationships we see, to believe that loving someone unconditionally means loving someone despite, any type of actions they might have taken and not applying a consequence. So radical love isn't unconsequential. And so remembering that, it's still important to place safety measures in order to protect people, in order to protect yourself. And that doesn't mean you won't necessarily love someone, but it definitely means, okay, this is a line where I can no longer take these actions to prioritize you as a person that I'm giving a treatment of love rather than a treatment of hate that you actually deserve.
Got it. So it's not like blind love or blind faith, or you still want to be able to take protective measures to guard against your heart if somebody else doesn't evaluate it the same way. Okay. So then I want to follow up on that. So like, let's say that there's somebody who truly wants to connect, who wants to really maybe take it to that next level, but hasn't been able to identify someone, but they're coming off of a hurtful relationship where they still haven't really kind of processed that or gotten over that. How could that person practice radical love to be able to get through that situation, to be able to open their hearts up for maybe something else down the road?
I think it would require, in the same situation as loving against an oppressive force, it would be starting with loving themselves. But also realizing, before getting out into a space where you're vulnerable again and you're fearful of falling into the same space that you were before, taking a moment to realize who loves you, who is there for you, who is appreciative of the person you are and what you bring to the table, and not necessarily needing to see that in a romantic way, but seeing, who is there to help you heal, who is there to hear your hurts. And I think a lot of times it takes counseling to get to that space to realize, there are other people who you can depend on. There are other people who want to see you succeed and don't necessarily want to see you in the space that you were before. So realizing your support network and having a support network to love, I think, is really healthy in restoring that exchange that two people have. I think it's important to realize that sometimes you need a little bit more inundation of, feeling loved by other people in order to heal enough to go into another situation. And so I think the radical measure comes in when someone is willing to risk again, to, be vulnerable again, to seek a space that is not dangerous to love again. And then once they have made that leap, once they have come to that space where they feel healed enough to love again and to be loved, because I think that's definitely, one of the spaces that makes people fearful is the fear of being loved, surprisingly. I think when someone reaches that point and they've healed enough to be there, I think they can look back and still continue to love the person who harmed them. And, I think that's radical in itself, but also being able to, love a person from a distance and say, there's nothing bad that I wish upon you. That doesn't mean, you need to be in communication with a person again, nor does it mean you need to, reach out and let them know, hey, I love you. Like, oftentimes that's not even necessary, but putting yourself in the mindset to not wish them harm, and to wish peace upon them and be peaceful within the situation, or even to, love yourself enough to clear them from being on your mind. And I think, that's easier said than done for sure. But I've spoken to a lot of people who have been able to get to that point, and it takes heart. It takes a lot of heart to be able to let a person go, especially if harm has taken place, whether emotionally, mentally, anything that falls into the harm category. And being able to step back and be at peace and move forward.
Okay, definitely. And so what about like in a situation where maybe there wasn't that closure, where maybe somebody was hurt, but they're not sure what happened or how things ended up the way that they did? How can that person be able to move on from that situation to still be able to practice that radical love?
That's tough, because I think, unfortunately, we live in a time where no closure has to be closure. Because there's not really that opportunity. People can ghost if they want, and people can, without any hesitation, feel no obligation to give anyone an answer about, what they've been through, or about why they're no longer with a person. And so I think, at some point we have to stop seeking closure. It's really difficult. Just because I think, naturally human beings want an answer. They want to know, why did a certain situation happen? Why was a person no longer interested? Were they themselves not good enough? I think it comes from a reasonable, good place of, wanting to apply this knowledge to a future situation and not fall into that category again. But I think also, people have this desire that if they had closure, they would also have an opportunity for rekindling and for reigniting. And they're looking for that instead of actual closure, because they see closure as an opportunity, for conversation. And lack of closure means there is an opening. And that might be in one person's mindset and not in the other. But, people will seek that opening. And so being able to get to a space where you can accept that you're not going to get closure is sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself, because, you'll keep pushing, you'll keep pressing to get to that space where you can speak with a person and understand. And they might lie to you, they might give you the truth, you might not get an answer at all. And if there's really, a desire for closure, what is the point of that conversation? At the end of the day, if things are actually done, if there's no way to actually heal yourself by having that closure, if there's no opportunity to, have a hope for the future from that conversation, then I think oftentimes it's better to let it go. And letting go is a challenge. It's not comfortable, but also I think it's necessary. Just because even with closure, does that mean letting go? Even with closure, does that mean you gain the peace that you wanted about a situation? Oftentimes you end up getting your feelings hurt again, but having that closure. And so, don't get your feelings hurt. Protect yourself by taking that measure to say, okay, like, this is clearly over. I might not have my answers. I might actually have some answers and don't like them. So I want to find out a different answer. And, I think it takes, effort to be in that space to let go. But I think oftentimes it's necessary. And, it protects the future person that you have, because you spend so much time trying to reignite what's ended, trying to, restore what you've obviously left, when you could be working on healing yourself, learning to love yourself, and then in the future, learning to love another person. Yet you've revolved your time and your energy around restoring or finding closure on what's lost.
Mm-hmm. No, so true. I think your explanation was so interesting. It's very important. Like a lot of times when relationships end, people tend to feel like it's a reflection on them.
Mhm.
So they feel like I need this closure because I need to find out what happened, and they take it like personal that the person is not interested anymore or that the relationship ended. But if you take responsibility for your own journey and accept, I think that's like a very important part. Accept that the other person's decision is not your responsibility, even though it's very painful. But I like, so my takeaway from everything that you said is that we have to learn to accept things that we cannot control, even though it's hard. So it's like an intentional decision. The same thing with radical love. It's an intentional decision. It doesn't happen naturally.
Awesome. So then I wanted to ask you about like your journey personally. So like how were you introduced to this concept of radical love?
I would say I think it's something, I've seen throughout my life. I would start by saying, I first saw it in my home with my parents. I think their love in the face of adversity. And I'll give context to that. So my parents are an interracial couple, and they were married in Alabama when they still lynched people. And this was in the 80s, actually. And they actually had to change their wedding date because their wedding, or the church where their wedding was going to be bombed. And so even in the face of that, and in many things that happened throughout their marriage, they still chose to love in the face of that. And, push the boundary of, being a white man and a Black woman in a still segregated America at the time. And so I think, that being very much a part of their story and being shared in our home was very much something that, showed that radical love is possible and good things can come out of it. But also, throughout my own reading and throughout, ideas that my parents very intentionally had present in our home, such as thoughts from Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela, and Ella Baker, and being able to really read into, these thoughts and these, I don't even know how to describe it, basically philosophies on why radical love is the key, why radical love is necessary. And I think, that really cultivated a space of being able to think with that as the framework on how we take our actions. At the same time, really diving into, the opposites of radical love, or being able to find radical love in things that might not, seem as such. And so I think with that as the background for a lot of, knowledge and social action and justice thinking that was in my household, that was my introduction to radical love. I think that would be the starting point for it. And a lot of other things that I've seen throughout my life and in my community have really set the tone for this being something that I want to pursue in regards to thought and scholarly works.
Wow, no, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Like having been exposed to it early on in like your own, upbringing, your own household, and then taking it a step further through your own work and the literature that, you research and things like that. And so obviously you had a good foundation, but let's say for like somebody who doesn't have that kind of foundation, but still want to kind of practice this, how would that process go for that person? Like how long does it take to really kind of put this into practice?
Right. I think, reading about it would be really helpful to see what you're getting yourself into, because this isn't always, the most fun practice, the most fun. I wouldn't even use fun as the word. It's not even always the most practical way to think about handling situations, but it's worth it. So I would challenge someone who's never been exposed to this, or this isn't, their go-to way of carrying their selves or their mindset. I would suggest, breaking down where you can apply love to hard situations. Don't necessarily start with your worst enemy. Don't necessarily start with your greatest conflict, but start with something small,
Okay.
and see where you can show love in a situation. Maybe, someone grew up in a neighborhood that was heavily gentrified, and they're upset about people who have gentrified their neighborhood, people who have, harmed their economics. Thinking about a way you can serve in that neighborhood. So whether that is going and volunteering at a school or helping a business with their accounting and finances, so they can potentially stay open, and realizing how you can put yourself on the side of the people you want to help rather than focusing on, retaliation or um, just using your energy on the people who can't solve your problem. I think one of the most radical things about radical love is you're focusing on the people who can help you solve your problem. And so finding a small problem, finding where you can fit in to help is resistance in itself. Even self-care can be a form of resistance against the people who don't want to see you succeed. And so realizing in the little things first where you can put action towards pushing back without making your pushback focused on, the people carrying out the burdensome actions, but focusing on the success and uplifting of the people you're fighting for, such as your community in the gentrification example. You're finding a way where you can radically love your community in the face of what's happening. Um, and it's not necessarily going to be this clash or this fighting back. I think that often comes to mind when we think of the word radical. Um, but I think the thought provoking thing is really unpacking, how much power you're infusing into your situation by putting love into the situation. It's literally fuel for what's going to ignite the pushback that actually defeats, the opposition, the structure, the system, the institution that is pushing back onto you. And I think, that puts us back into the framework of focusing our strategies and our advocacy on defeating systems and unraveling institutions rather than defeating people.
Wow, no, I love it. You're
Yeah,
speaking my language
like
right
that.
now, because I'm all about deconstructing the systems and defeating
Mm-hmm.
the systems, because a lot of times we get so, focused on individuals and people when that's not really the battle that we need to wage against. So I really love that idea. And also like what you said, as far as like finding a business and pouring into it and things like that. I wanted to kind of then ask you about Black Dollar, which I know is like a business venture of yours. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, so Black Dollar is an app that I created with the help of a developer, and it's actually launching very soon. But it is an app that helps people locate Black businesses. So you'll put in your location, it'll help you find Black businesses near you so you can intentionally shop at Black businesses or purchase Black owned services. In addition to that, it also helps Black owned businesses and services find potential clients. And so there's a portion where they're listed on the directory. They can also apply or subscribe to have more direct links between themselves and their potential clients. So this really I'm hoping that this will help people to invest into the Black community very intentionally. I think this is something that's on people's hearts. Even though this, began to develop before what we've seen in the last couple of weeks with how our country is really, bringing to light something that's been part of its foundation. I think this is going to be something that really helps us get through this and go beyond, and establish an intentional investment in our communities and lift our communities higher than they've been before, by putting our dollar back into the people who are going to help us be solid, be a family within one another. And I think that's going to be really helpful in breaking the institutions and systems that have kept us in certain spaces. So I really look forward to this not being necessarily something that's going to support, my own ventures and my own family, even though I really hope that does happen. My hope is very much so that this will help people to, invest in the businesses that are close to them, and help the people that will actually keep the money in the community that's going to support schools and nonprofits and really bring to life what we would like to see in our communities.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's great. And is this going to be in all states in the US?
It should be very soon. I'm really hoping that works out. So my intention is that every business will be on the directory, and they can apply to be on there if they're not already known. And so businesses will have access to getting themselves out there. And then people who want to buy from Black-owned businesses will be able to access that entire directory and be alerted to what Black businesses are around them.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think you said it earlier, like people's hearts are open right now more than ever to supporting Black-owned businesses. So I think this is definitely something that people are going to want to find out about to be able to know where they can lend that support. So that's awesome. And so like, what was the inspiration behind this venture?
It had been on my mind for quite some time, and I looked into it, and it was way bigger of an investment than I was prepared to make at the time. And so I kept the idea in my notes, so it still add to, this vision I had. I had different names for it because I eventually see it being something even bigger that's really going to help people network and people thrive and build communities literally from the ground up. But eventually I had to pick a starting point. And so I think this is my starting point. And, throughout this quarantine season, I've really just been focused on watching webinars, whether it's something that I can see helping me now or in the future, whether it's related to finance, tech, self-help. And I happened to come across one webinar that basically talked about, building a home for your business, building an app that will help, do whatever you want to do with your vision. And most of the ideas that were presented at that webinar were related to businesses that were already established, that are already functioning. But I thought, I'm graduating soon. This was back, before I had graduated. And I think, this would be a solid time to focus on developing this vision I have. And so I prayed, and then I purchased the LLC, and it was crazy. I was like, I must have lost my mind, just because this is something really big to take on by myself. But, there it was. And I think, influentially, I'm always reading about finance and looking at specific, Black-owned finance corporations or credit help. And so really having that in my mind all the time, and every time I look at Instagram, looking at different ways to get out of debt or invest, I think that's something that was very much in my mind. But I want to see other people be able to do that for communities, whether that's on their mind or not, whether their intention is to build, their own financial capital or their community's financial capital, where that doesn't necessarily have to be their state of mind, where maybe they just want to invest in their community. Maybe they just want to buy a product or service that they know is going to work for them. And so in combining, those ideas, but also my vision, I set it into stone, and here we are. So it'll be out very soon. And I'm excited to see where that goes and how that helps people.
Most definitely. Congrats on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm excited to download it.
Yeah, just
Thank you.
whenever it comes out, let us know. We'll certainly support it for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Definitely. Did you have anything else?
No, I'm just excited to hear all your ideas, and I think it's great how you're like, it's like you have a vision of what you want to do, and you started somewhere. That's how it starts, and then once you do this, you're gonna open opportunities to connect with other people. You never know what's gonna happen, so your other goals can be implemented.
Yeah, and also just the fact that you seem to have the right mindset. Like you're not just doing it like a profitable venture. Obviously, if that comes, that's good. But it seems like you just really want to help others and put them in a position to be successful as well. And I think when you have the right intentions like that, then usually good things, happen. The profit part will come eventually. So.
Thank you. I'll thrive when my community thrives. So that's where my focus is right now. I want to see, people that I've never encountered with, businesses that I've never heard of. I want them to succeed. And so even if that's not monetary success, I see it under the framework of Ubuntu. I even mentioned this in my TED Talk, but it's always on my mind. It's when someone else succeeds, that means we all succeed. If our community is hurting, we're hurting. If we're thriving, we're all thriving. And so I'm excited to see us all thrive.
Wow.
Yeah. So she has radical love for her community.
Thank you. I try my very best.
Wow,
Nice.
that's awesome. Well, Olivia, we definitely thank you for taking the time and really sharing all your wealth and knowledge with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being invited. I love this podcast, and I'm just really appreciative that we got to have this conversation.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you.
Well, there you have it, folks. That's our show for today.
Thanks for tuning in.
And as always, like it or not,
Beard and Curls is the new his and hers.